Hey, Philosophical Lifer, it is Christopher here, and today we're going to talk about the meaning of life. You're going to learn about two views on the meaning of life, that of Christine Ventrano and that of Susan Wolf. That will help you think critically about the meaning of life so that you can live a more meaningful life. Let's jump into the slides. As you can see here, this is a picture of essentially a cowboy, and he's been living off the grid for 40 years. Actually, Vice News found him living off the grid in 2011 and went and interviewed him. So I want you to have in the back of your mind, can someone like that, live a meaningful life? I want to make you aware of an upcoming opportunity. I'm currently working on a course on the meaning of life. It's called Mission: What is the Meaning of Life? So the goal in the course is, as it says there in the tag, to discover how to live a meaningful life by thinking critically about 5 key questions. Now you might wonder, what key questions are we going to look at? Well, each key question is a mission itself. First, we're going to look at what does it mean to ask the big question, what is the meaning of life? Second mission will be, is life meaningless because it's absurd? The third mission will be, is life's meaning subjective or objective? The fourth mission will be, what things make life more meaningful? And then the fifth mission is fulfilling God's purpose the source of meaning? So these 5 missions will help you live a more meaningful life. If you want to register to be the first to know about the class when it goes live, go ahead and go to www.thephilosophicallife.com/mission. Now, let's take a look at Susan Wolf's big idea. What was Susan Wolf's big idea? Well, her big idea is basically that a meaningful life is one in which you're actively engaged in projects of worth. So you've got active engagement and projects of worth. Now let's cash this out a little bit more. You're actively engaged in projects when you're, as she says, gripped, excited, involved in the projects. Think about something that you love doing. Could be a hobby or it could be something you do at work and you just can't wait to get to it. Maybe it's rebuilding cars, maybe it's doing something on Etsy, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's a sport, and just think about something that you're really gripped by, you're really excited to actually do. That's what she means by being actively engaged in a project. So that's the subjective dimension of her view. That is, you have some sort of attraction to that project. Now, what does it mean for something to be a project of worth? Well, here Wolf essentially relies on intuitions about cases to figure out what it means for something to be a project of worth. So she breaks them down as follows. Worthwhile projects are things like relationships, aesthetic enterprises, so things involving art and beauty, cultivation of virtues, so things like humility, things like courage, and religious practices. She views those things as worthwhile projects. Next, she says that not worthwhile projects are collecting rubber bands. I don't know if you remember, this might date me a little, but people used to make gigantic rubber band balls. Maybe you've seen those, especially when people used to get the newspaper in physical form. People just collect all the rubber bands from the newspapers and they make this giant ball. Well, if you collected those rubber bands and even if you made a giant ball out of them, that for her would be a worthless project. Memorizing the dictionary. My grandma actually used to read the dictionary, which is kind of crazy. Wolf would consider that worthless. Or handwriting copies of War and Peace. So just literally sitting there. I guess we got to imagine too, you don't actually sell them or anything. You just literally, your whole project is just handwriting copies of War and Peace. So she views that as meaningless. Now, here are some controversial cases. So Wolf says these are worthless cases, worthless projects. So imagine a corporate lawyer that is sacrificing her health and private life for climbing the corporate ladder. So her whole goal is maybe to become a partner in the firm, and she's climbing this corporate ladder, hoping to one day achieve some sort of top position and make tons of money and be revered. And at that point, I've heard you can kind of cut back a little bit on your hours, but early on as a lawyer, you basically sacrifice, if you're trying to reach the top, you sacrifice a ton of hours, personal life, and so on to climb the ladder. So Woolf would think that's actually a worthless project. A devotee of a religious cult. So if you belong to a cult that has inherently false beliefs and is completely misguided on spiritual and religious matters, then even though you devoted yourself to that, you get a lot of passion out of the projects you do for that cult. Ultimately, she would view those projects and those activities as completely worthless. And then she mentions the pig farmer. So this is a quote, the pig farmer who, quote, buys more land to grow more corn to feed more pigs, to buy more land to grow more corn to feed more pigs. So you can see there's just this back and forth of growing land to buying land to grow corn to feed pigs and so on. And the cycle just keeps going on and on. Now, what is VITRANO'S objection to Woolf's account of a meaningful life? Well, for VITRANO, Woolf tries to ground an objective view of what counts as worthwhile projects, while by her own admission, Woolf's own admission, she has neither, as it says, a quote, a philosophical theory of what objective value is, nor a substantive theory about what has that sort of value. So recall, she just relies on intuitions about cases. You're going to intuitively, she's hoping, think that collecting rubber bands is worthless, whereas working on relationships is not. So VITRANO picks up on this missing aspect of her Woolf's objective part of her view of the meaning of life. And she says, look, basically not everyone is going to share your intuitions, Woolf. As VITRANO says here, quote, spending thousands of hours training for a marathon strikes many as wearisome. They may be far more engaged by computer games. On the other hand, grappling with a New York Times Sunday magazine crossword puzzle, my wife loves crossword puzzles, this would be a big one for her, is a popular intellectual challenge, holding far more appeal for most than reading an article on metaethics, a subject Woolf finds fascinating. VITRANO is accusing Woolf of picking and choosing what projects she finds of worth without really having any sort of objective theory of what grounds worthwhileness of projects in terms of their value. Now, here's a possible objection VITRANO considers to her line of pressing Woolf. So someone might reply to VITRANO, yeah, we can separate things and figure out what's objectively worthwhile. It's really does the person take that thing seriously. So if they really take seriously doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, then it's not just a hobby and it's objectively meaningful. Now, here's the problem, though, that VITRANO responds to. The problem is that then why you engage in an activity will essentially determine whether it's meaningful or not. Now, why is that a problem? Well, for Woolf, it's an objective dimension of her theory of a meaningful life that the project is worthwhile. And if you actually go in the subject and it becomes, well, what's the intention behind which the person pursues the activity, and that determines whether it's worthwhile or not, then you have a case like the following that VITRANO mentions, which involves a physicist. So the physicist basically does his research like it's more for the reason that it brings him enjoyment. It's less taken seriously than it is taken more like a hobby. Whereas the physicist is very serious about his chess. So he works chess problems, and that is something he takes very seriously. So for the physicist, doing physics and solving puzzles of the deepest structure of the universe would be meaningless, whereas solving problems regarding chess for him would be meaningful, which intuitively that gets things backwards. Intuitively, the meaningful project would be doing physics research, whereas doing chess would be meaningless, at least according to the objective scale of value that Wolf wants. So Ventrano thinks this is a problem for Wolf. Now, you may recall from a previous video I just did, the last video we did in this Exploring Ethics series was on Camus versus Richard Taylor. And you may recall Taylor is a subjectivist about the meaning of life. That is, he views the meaning of life in terms of having a fulfilling life, having your desires fulfilled. So he has a what you might call desire fulfillment view of the meaning of life. Now, as you can see here, though, Ventrano objects to Taylor. That is, Ventrano thinks Taylor's account is missing a moral dimension. So we need to mention this, even discussing Wolf and Ventrano, to get Ventrano's full view out on the table. So a person might get, as Ventrano thinks, long-term satisfaction that shows no due regard for anyone. So showing due regard to people is like showing them what they deserve in terms of respect as persons. And she thinks that's problematic. So even if you're doing something that you find fulfilling and brings you long-term satisfaction, you still have to act morally in that process. And only then does it contribute to living a meaningful life. Now, as Ventrano says, quote, even if a person's life is enjoyable, if it is morally unworthy, displaying no concern for the welfare of others, then such a life does not deserve to be judged positively by anyone with moral compunctions, end quote. So now let's go back to the case involving Faustino. Taylor might say, well, Faustino's life brings him satisfaction. Even though he lives alone, he really enjoys what he does, and so his life is meaningful. Ventrano would say, yeah, his life is enjoyable, but he displays no concern for the welfare of others. In fact, Faustino only goes into town once every 2 years. Town is like this 2-day arduous journey, and he only does it essentially just to sell his cattle once every couple years, and then whatever he makes from that, he lives on for the next few years. Then he lives off the land the rest of the way. So he shows no due regard for anyone. In fact, he's even shot at people who've tried to come on his land. He has no interaction with others, shows them no due regard or respect. Therefore, he actually lives a immoral life in that regard. And so even though his projects bring him happiness, they also take him away from his moral obligations to others. Now, Wolf would say, though he actively pursues his pastoral projects of working the land, raising cattle, it's unclear that the projects are of objective worth. So remember the pig farmer. As you may recall, the pig farmer, buys more land to raise more corn, to feed the corn to the pigs, and then to sell that to buy the pigs, to buy more land, and so on, right? They just keep repeating this cycle. And essentially, Faustino does the same thing, right? He works the land, he raises cattle, he takes them to town once every couple of years, he sells them to have money to work the land, to raise cattle, to sell them, and so on. So his life resembles the pig farmer. Now let's take a look at Ventrano's actual positive account. So how does Ventrano try to overcome this? Well, she essentially combines the best of both worlds. She combines the best of Taylor with what she regards as the best of Wolf. That is, a meaningful life involves acting morally while achieving happiness. So the subjective dimension is achieving happiness, and the objective dimension is essentially fulfilling your moral obligation. Happiness for her, let's drill in a little bit, is feeling satisfied with your life while, and this is the key as well, as she says, quote, not suffering excessively from anxiety, alienation, frustration, disappointment, or depression. You're overall satisfied with your life, and you don't have any of those major factors that would detract from your overall well-being. Now, satisfaction for her involves something like a stoic-like acceptance of what you can control. Quote, you cannot control the events outside of you. If your satisfaction depends on whether others praise you, then they control how satisfied you will be with your life. If you wish to avoid being subject to the powers of others, then you have to free yourself from dependence on their judgments. So you might have heard of Stoicism. Stoics are very much about determining what you can control and what you can't. And as this quote says, if you essentially put your satisfaction on the approval of others, a factor you can't control, whether they approve of you or not, then you're going to have a lot of dissatisfaction in your life because you've given them the power to decide whether or not you find your life worthwhile or satisfying. Now, as Ventrano continues, we shouldn't judge some activities are more conducive to a meaningful life than others. So this is what she thinks Woolf got wrong. For instance, Philippa Foot, I also did a video on Philippa Foot and why for Foot, moral action is rational action. You can check that out, provide a link below. She cautions against, quote, childish pursuits. So essentially the admonition is for you to grow up. And if you're still doing childish things as an adult, then there's a sense in which you haven't really grown up. And Ventrano wonders, though, okay, well, which pursuits are childish? How about collecting dolls? Adults collect dolls. Telling jokes. Adults tell jokes. Think about Jerry Seinfeld, or just think about the jokester down the street. Planting veggies. My mom plants vegetables. Is that a childish pursuit? Selling cookies, running races, recounting adventures, or singing songs. These are things that children do and adults do. Well, assuming they meet their moral obligations, so assuming my mom isn't out planting veggies and yet she should actually be doing something for my sister and she's just totally neglecting it and just zoning out in her garden and to the neglect of the legit interests of my sister, then you can't really disparage them for their interests. And even though they might be things that children also do, we can't just say they're childish pursuits, they're worthless, they don't contribute to meaning. You need to grow up into the true projects or the adult-like projects. Ventrano thinks that's a problematic aspect of Woolf's account. What about cases? Well, let's just take a look. So how would Ventrano and Woolf come down on the cases that we talked about earlier? So collecting rubber bands, memorizing the dictionary, or handwriting copies of War and Peace. Let's take a look. Well, Woolf would think, as we mentioned at the start, they're worthless. Ventrano would say if the person finds those things satisfying, then as long as the person's not also neglecting part of their moral obligations in pursuing those things, then that satisfaction and the overall moral dimension makes it meaningful. Now, what about the more controversial cases that we talked about? The corporate lawyer sacrificing her health and private life for climbing the ladder, or a devotee of a religious cult, or the pig farmer. Are they doing things that are meaningful? Well, for Woolf, remember, even though they're controversial, Woolf lands on essentially they're worthless, and so they're meaningless. Now, Ventrano, on the other hand, would say if the people are acting morally while achieving happiness in doing these things, being a pig farmer, being like Faustino and tilling the land, but not doing it in abnegation of any due respect owed to others, that would be meaningful, right? So here's a key question I'd love for you to consider. Can a person who is without friends and without any appreciation for beauty nevertheless live a meaningful life? Now, Ventrano would likely say yes, as she says, some may be poor yet satisfied. Others may be alone yet satisfied. Still others may find satisfaction regardless of the depth of their learning or self-knowledge and irrespective of whatever illness or disability they may face. In any case, the judgment of satisfaction is the individual's, not anyone else's. So if the person is living alone, has no friends, and doesn't really appreciate beauty, they can still nevertheless live a meaningful life as long as they judge that what they're doing is satisfying. Now, Wolf would likely say no about these things, assuming there are no other projects of worth that are actively pursued in the person's life. So if they live a humdrum life and they're a loner and they don't really have any beauty that can contribute to meaning in their life, no appreciation of beauty, and so on, then for Wolf, that person would live a meaningless life. They would have a meaningless existence. Now let's raise a related question. Do you believe some activities are inherently more conducive to a meaningful life than others? So for instance, think about running races versus collecting dolls, or planting vegetables versus telling jokes. Do you think some of those activities are more conducive to a meaningful life than others? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments.